Absurd, 1981. On some films were caught in the panic. Others became central to it. This one did not just get banned. It became evidence in the argument that horror films themselves were a threat. Absurd presents a relentless sequence of violence that feels mechanical in its execution. The narrative exists, but it is secondary. What dominates is the repetition of brutality. A killer who does not stop. A structure that does not offer relief. When the film entered the United Kingdom, it was immediately targeted under the Video Nasties crackdown. Authorities did not treat it as a borderline case. They treated it as one of the most extreme examples available. It was successfully prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act. Copies were seized. Distribution was shut down. What made this case particularly significant was how it was used. The film was not just banned. It was cited as proof that unregulated video content could be harmful. It became part of a larger narrative pushed by politicians and media. A narrative that horror films were eroding moral standards. That transformed the film into something larger than itself. It was no longer just a controversial title. It became a symbol, a justification for tighter control, a reason to expand censorship laws. And once a film becomes a symbol, it loses its individual identity. It is no longer judged on its own terms. It is judged on what it represents. In this case, it represented everything authorities feared about the growing home video market, and that fear ensured it would not be allowed to circulate freely.
Joe D'Amato returned with a direct spiritual successor to Anthropophagus, and this time he borrowed the blueprint from John Carpenter's Halloween almost frame for frame. Absurd, also known as Anthropophagus 2 in some markets and Monster Hunter in others, followed an unkillable killer through a small American-style town in a film shot in Italy, with an Italian cast attempting American accents with varying degrees of success. What made Absurd distinct on the Video Nasties list was its sheer procedural brutality. The kills are slow, methodical, and filmed with a clinical detachment that reads less like horror filmmaking and more like a forensic documentary. D'Amato was not building suspense. He was presenting violence as a sequence of steps, each one shown completely and without flourish. British censors seized it quickly, and it joined the prosecutable list alongside its predecessor. The dual presence of both D'Amato films on the list was used by prosecutors to establish a pattern of deliberate obscenity production, an argument that was not entirely without merit, since D'Amato himself would have agreed that obscenity was part of the product description. George Eastman returned in the lead role and again wrote the screenplay under a pseudonym. The two men had built a small but functional factory for producing exactly the kind of content that governments across Europe were desperate to suppress. Absurd is not a great film. It is barely a competent one in places, but it is a perfectly preserved artifact of a very specific moment in cinema history when the question of what could be shown was being answered in Italian studios with gleeful, anarchic defiance.